Alrighty, hello and welcome. So today's video is going to be centered around the Monolith of Fate, the new, well, sort of new endgame system that we've been playing around with for the last few weeks. And there's been a lot of divide in the community over the difficulty or the challenge of the Monolith of Fate. Some people think that it's way too easy, others think it's way too hard. And I've come to the conclusion that I think a lot of the difference in opinion has to do with approaches to the Monolith of Fate. I think some players are missing out on some tips or some strategies that will make their life in the Monolith of Fate significantly easier, especially on the bosses. So this video is going to be designed to do just that, to provide those tips or those strategies to players so that they can figure out the Monolith of Fate in a way that is more conducive of how the players who are doing it relatively easily are going about it. And so there's gonna be 6 tips in here, and I believe if you follow these tips, you will have a much better time, especially on those bosses and getting through your clears in a reasonable amount of time without too many deaths, hopefully. So here it is. Here are my tips. We'll start with number 1. So the first tip is get your glancing blow to 100%, and also, if you can, get your critical strike avoidance to 100%. Critical strike avoidance is secondary in this particular case. Glancing blow is mandatory, and pretty much the entire community agrees at this point that glancing blow is mandatory for basically all builds, with some very extreme exceptions. And you're probably not in those exceptions because they're ridiculously broken builds. Okay, so how do we get our glancing blow to 100%? Well, it's relatively simple. There are several ways of doing it. There's a prefix called set glancing blow. There's a suffix that's just glancing blow. There are some idols for certain classes. There are also some passives, and there is a unique that drops off the first boss in Monolith of Fate that gives 85%. The generally best strategy to get your glancing blow, though, is the prefixes, the set glancing blow. These will basically multiply how much they give you per how many of those affixes you have on your gear. 4 tier 5 will get you 100%. But when you are first gearing, when you're first getting the Monolith of Fate, my suggestion is get glancing blow basically however you can. 100% glancing blow is your priority. You can sacrifice some other stats temporarily to get your glancing blow to 100%. That is not only okay, it's what I recommend you do. After you've got your glancing blow, then you can work on your other stats. But glancing blow, I believe, and I think most community will agree with me, is your number 1 priority when you first get to the endgame system. So push that however you can get it. Set glancing blow is your preference. It, by the way, drops as enduring as an affix on gear that drops in the world. But any other options for glancing blow, definitely consider them. Get that to 100%, and then if you can, get your crit strike avoidance there as well. But again, that's secondary. You can do these bosses without the crit strike avoidance, but the glancing blow, have to have it. Okay, tip number 2, once you've done glancing blow and potentially crit avoidance, is you're looking at your other layers of defense. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can build your defenses in this game, and a lot of them are viable. You can do high health, you can do high protections, you can do a bunch of dodge with health, you can do high ward builds. I'm just going to make one suggestion here that's like kind of a generalized one, but any of those will work if you know what you're doing. If you want something that's kind of just sort of universal, I suggest going with protections. Protections will cut out a portion of the damage you would take into your health, and you can also focus them for what you need. So for example, if you're dealing with a boss who does necrotic and physical damage, you can focus your armor and necrotic for that particular boss should you wish to do so. So you can specialize, although you don't need to. You can generally gear for everything and still be perfectly fine as long as your gear is good enough. But for a general rule of thumb, if you're doing the non-empowered ones, I'm going to say you need probably at very least 500 of the prots for the particular damage type that you're going against the boss. So if you're doing the necrotic and the physical, you want 500 necrotic and 500 armor. But more realistically or more safely, you're probably looking at 1,000 plus. That seems like a lot, but it's definitely more than doable. But yes, you will be focusing your defenses significantly in this sort of gearing style, but that's kind of how the bosses are built right now. They're built to put out quite a bit of damage and not take all that much damage. And so that's kind of how we build for those bosses right now currently. Hopefully that changes a little bit over time, but if you want to have the best time of it against the bosses, this is where I suggest you go. Okay. Next, once you've done those 2 things, look for primarily move speed, but also, if you can pick it up, chill. So move speed's probably pretty obvious. There's a lot of mechanics that the bosses do. Those mechanics can one-shot you or do significant damage to you. The faster you are, the easier generally it is to get out. Now, there is some, we'll say, rumors or some belief going around the community that you need like 100% move speed, and that's absolutely false. You definitely don't need that. My suggestion is get a good pair of boots with decent move speed on them, like 10 plus, 12, 13, and then put the move speed suffix on, the celerity suffix. If you can get that to tier 5, great, but if you can get it to tier 3, tier 4, you should be fine. If you can get yourself over 25%, somewhere between 25 and 50% move speed, you should be able to get out of most of the mechanics, if not all of them. Now, as far as chill goes, this is a more interesting one, because what chill does is actually slows down the enemy, and so if you have chill on, you will actually slow down the boss's attacks, giving yourself more time to get out. Now, not every build has access to chill or easy access. Everyone can with a weapon, but for some builds that's harder than others. And so this is not a necessity, but it will give you a much easier time. You get 12% move speed reduction, or not move speed, attack speed, move speed as well, but attack speed reduction per stack of chill, and you can put 3 stacks on. So if you have chill and you get 3 stacks, you're up to 36% attack speed reduction on the boss. And that's going to make your life a lot easier. But again, not necessary, just makes the fight quite a bit easier should you be able to pick up some chill. Tip 4, learn the boss mechanics. This might sound obvious to some people, but a lot of people come into these games, these ARPG Diablo-likes, with the expectation that bosses aren't going to do a whole lot on the mechanic side, and they should be able to gear through them. And while it is possible to gear through these bosses, most builds are going to have to avoid at least some of the mechanics. When you come into these fights, you should think of them less like your typical ARPG fights or boss fights, and more like an MMO raid fight, because they're going to have mechanics that are much more closely aligned with that style, where if you stand in those mechanics, they will probably kill you, and there's quite a few of them, and so there's a bit of a learning curve. And so if you find yourself struggling on a boss, I suggest you go and check out some videos, watch the boss, see what they do. And in light of that, I will be releasing a series of boss guides here really soon after I release this video. So you'll be able to watch them, and I'll explain how the fights work and what you need to look out for and what's going to happen when you're in those fights, and just generally how to handle them in maybe a way that's better than if you didn't realize what was going on. Okay, this next one, which is tip 5, is probably the one that I think most players make the mistake of doing, which is picking your modifiers. So when you are in the timeline, you're doing your echoes, you're picking modifiers. You're picking ways that the enemies are becoming more powerful. And I don't know if all players realize it. I imagine a lot of players don't realize it. Most of those modifiers apply to the boss. And so if you pick a modifier and you reach the boss and that modifier is still up, the boss now has whatever that modifier is. Some of those modifiers can make the bosses nearly impossible, like truly nearly impossible, even for really good players. And so it's much better to choose modifiers that will not make the boss especially difficult. And so let's run through a short list here of what you should worry about, what you should look out for, and what are better choices to take. So let's start with ones you should never take. There's 3 of them, as far as I'm concerned. Number 1, Enrage. Number 2, Frenzy and Haste on Hit. If you are unfortunate enough to have picked both of those, you are probably not going to survive the second part of a boss fight, because they're going to be putting down their mechanics so quickly that you cannot dodge them. So do not take these. The third one, Armor and Prots as a percentage of health, is especially problematic for the bosses, because the bosses will actually increase their health based upon how hard you hit them. And so for high damage builds, they're going to get an absolute ton of armor and protections, and you're going to hit them like a wet noodle. And so just avoid this one, because it's going to be even more punishing the more damage you do. But even for lower damage build, it's still going to be punishing because the bosses have a lot of health. Okay, next here is the be careful taking too much of these. There's 2 particular types. or general types, broad types. First one is taking too much damage, especially if you've also taken the Mark for Death modifier, which increases the damage you take by 35%. You start stacking these too much, doesn't matter really how good your prots are, you are going to get into one-shot territory on a lot of the mechanics. So it's not that you can't take any of these, just be careful how many of the increased damage modifiers that you stack together, because you will get yourself in some really dangerous territory. On the other side of it is taking too many of the increased health modifiers if you're a low damage build. It's going to take you forever to kill it. So try to balance these out, especially given how many prots you have and how much damage you do. This really is more of a feel thing, but definitely just bear in mind, if you're taking all the damage modifiers, you're probably going to have a bad time. Okay, next here, situationally take these. So these are ones that, if you have the right setup, will make your life a lot easier, because they'll effectively do nothing or almost nothing against you. The first one is giving the boss or enemies glancing blow if you're a dot build. If you're a dot build, glancing blow isn't affected by dots, and so taking the glancing blow modifier will not affect you at all. Along that lines, crit avoidance will also not affect you at all if you're a dot build, because you don't crit with dot. But also, if you're a low crit chance build that's not relying on crit chance, you can also take the crit avoidance one. And the third one is crit chance on the boss, especially that base crit chance. If it says something crazy like plus 54% crit chance, means they're going to crit you more than half the time. Well, if you're crit capped, which was the first suggestion, it doesn't matter. They'll never crit you. And so crit capped, this one is like a free modifier. You'll never feel it at all. So this is another reason why crit avoidance cap is really good. Okay, and then the last one is the safe to take. You can take these no matter what. They're not going to make it easier for you in the echoes, but if you get to the boss and you take this one, it's going to be a cakewalk, which is anything that only applies to rare enemies. And the reason why is because the bosses, as far as we can tell, don't count as rare enemies. And so if you take any modifier that says gives them increased damage or increased health to rare enemies, anything along those lines, you can freely take this and the boss will not gain any power from it. And so that's a really big benefit if you are trying to do a boss and you're struggling with it, especially, and you can stack a couple of these rare enemy ones. You've just weakened that boss fight. You'll make it easier on yourself. Okay, last tip. Do not ignore the reroll option on the echoes. So I think a lot of people decide not to even consider the reroll for two reasons. One, well, it costs gold, and in some cases it costs quite a bit of gold. And two is it gives you a more powerful modifier. I think it's 25 or 30%. And those seem like good reasons to not reroll, but there are definitely times when you should at least think about rerolling. One is when you're staring two really bad modifiers in the face, especially if you're getting close to the boss. So let's say you're near the boss, there's a chance that you will get the boss already, and you have two options. One is Enrage at half health, and the other one is Frenzy and Haste when hit. You definitely don't want either of those, as we discussed in a previous tip. And so you would be much better off re-rolling and getting a more powerful version of a modifier that is not as bad as those two are. You might get lucky and get something like the rare one, or maybe a crit one and you're crit capped. And so those would be far, far better no matter how powerful they are. Also, if you are in that range where there's a percentage chance that the boss will pop, that also applies to the reroll, and so you can actually reroll yourself into the quest. And so that will save you both echoes and also more powerful modifiers, because the farther you progress into the monolith, the more powerful the modifiers become. And so those are two very good reasons to consider the reroll option. I don't reroll all of the time, especially if I don't have a chance to pop the boss and the modifiers I'm looking at are fine. But if one of those two scenarios happens, I will almost always reroll, either if I'm really trying to pop the boss and I'm fine with the modifiers I think I'm going to get, or if I've got really bad modifiers and I want to see if I can get something better. All right, that's it. That's all I've got. Those six right there, I think will make a huge difference. If you are able to do all six of those, you're going to have a much, much better time with these boss fights, and just with the timelines in general. It's going to be a lot easier for you Trust me, this is what I do. This is how I get through them. I'm careful on modifiers. I've got my glancing blow. I've generally got my crit cap. I've got my defense at a reasonable place. I've got enough movement speed. These are all the kind of things that I am doing, and it's why I'm able to get through these with relative ease. I don't usually die on bosses. Sometimes, I mean, anybody can die on these bosses. You just can get hit, you know, the wrong way or aren't paying attention. But usually, I'm going to kill the boss on the first attempt. And this is generally why, because I'm planning them out accordingly to make those fights a lot easier for me. So hopefully this really helps you out. Let me know in the comments if it is actually working out for you. If you have any other ideas or tips or suggestions, also feel free to add those in the comments, things that have worked for you on the echoes or on the boss fights. Also, I stream 5 to 6 days a week on Twitch. I will stream the Monolith generally more often than anything else. So if you want to check out some Monolith content or watch me make some builds, absolutely feel free. Come check it out. Come chat with us. Would love to have you. And I have a Discord. So if you want to chat more about the Monolith or other things LE related or even ARPG related, hop in and join us. We've usually got a good conversation going. All right, thank you so much, and have a great time in Last Epoch.